Welcome back, everybody, to our daily 5-minute Bible study where we take a look at one chapter of the Bible at a time, and we have a PDF that has all our information on it, which you can download on our website at tobelikechrist.com. We are in Job 24 today, and this is going to be, again, pretty similar to a lot of the other discussion that we've had in this second section of Job. So in chapters 1 and 2, we talked about Job being persecuted, being caused to suffer by Satan, and then Job's friends come along, Bildad, Zophar, and I've forgotten the other one, Eliphaz, and they are discussing why Job is suffering because they don't know that Satan is behind this. And so we're in this second section. This is a very somewhat long discourse, chapters 3 through 37, chapter 24 today. I know for those of you who have been studying with us for, all 24 days, you're probably sick of hearing me repeating the same thing on the first page, but hopefully, it won't be too long before we'll actually have a new character here. There are actually more than, just Job and his three friends. There's at least one other character that we're going to introduce by the time we finish this discourse. So, exciting stuff. We'll have a change in our character section, but our characters for today are just Job and his three friends. The heading over our 25 verses today is Job challenges his friends to prove that he's wrong. Again, we're going to see him kind of tackling the obvious objection to their argument, and that is that, hey, look, sinners don't always get punished right away. They don't even always get punished while they're alive. So how can your conclusions be correct? Job wondered why God didn't distribute justice on a more regular basis, and why God's people often didn't get to see the wicked being judged. If his friends were right about the way that God judged people, Job expected to see God act against sinners on a pretty regular and timely basis, a schedule, right? But, you sin, Job's friends say, well, if you sin, you get punished for it. So you should see that playing out in the world, right? You sin one day, a couple days later, you should expect God's going to give you what you deserve for that. But of course, Job's saying that doesn't happen. Job brought this up to tear down his friend's argument. The reality was that judgment didn't always befall wicked people in a predictable way, and some people just seemed to get away with their wickedness altogether. There were evil men who cheated people out of their property, who stole livestock, who abused the poor, yet no obvious sign of God's judgment was afflicting them. Job asked his friends where justice was for the poor who had to serve evil men, evil masters, for those who went hungry, for those who didn't have any clothing, for those who worked in the fields of unjust men, for those who suffered while their wicked employers lived in luxury. Why didn't God fix those situations if God really was as predictable as Job's friends said he was with his judgments? Job goes on and he says, well, what about the rebels against God who are walking around in the streets of our towns? What about the murderous thieves who escape, who get away with what they do? What about the adulterers who conceal their identity to commit their immoralities? What about those who are friends of the darkness and hate the light? According to Bildad, Zophar, and Eliphaz, all of these guys should be experiencing observable and visible humiliation from God. Yet that just wasn't the case. Their lives were as long as everybody else's lives. They were as secure on earth as the rest of their rich friends, and they died alongside their righteous contemporaries, all of them being harvested together as if there was no distinction between them. Job compares them to, like a wheat harvest. They're all collected up by God together in death, and it's like there's no distinction between the good and the bad sometimes. Job concludes with a challenge to his friends, saying this in verse 25, "If it is not so, who will prove me a liar and show that there is nothing in what I say?" Right? If that's not true, prove it, because I can look around the world and see all these people who don't seem to be suffering the things I've suffered, and I haven't even done anything wrong. So if you're right, prove it. I think this is a pretty good point by Job, and what we're going to see is the arguments of his friends beginning to phase out here. They're not going to have a whole lot else to say, and maybe that's because this really is a pretty good argument against what they believed. So let's go down now and talk about an application for this chapter. Job's friends and their adherence to this, quote, wisdom of the day is a good lesson for us about the value and the limits of human philosophy. The best human reasoning at that time was blind to some very important details about the situation, namely what we're told in Job 1 and 2, and its blindness led its adherents to a lot of wrong conclusions. I know many people, even many Christians, who are enamored with the, quote, great thinkers of history, and they spend as much or maybe even more time reading the words of these great thinkers than they do the words of God. And while I do think that there can be great value and a lot of wisdom gleaned from those men and women of the past, I think it's equally important to remember that they were blind to many things, as are we. They can't always be trusted as a source of truth because of their lack of vision into spiritual realities, just like Job's friends here. They may have drawn conclusions that seemed rational in our physical world, but their observations could only extend so far. For this reason, I would encourage people to spend a lot more time reading the inspired words of God than the sometimes uninformed words of men. Only God can reveal the true and the full nature of things to us. You know, a lot of people in our world speak very definitively about why things happen, and they reason through it and they ascribe a physical reason for why current event happens or why there's a cultural shift or maybe why a war happens or a natural disaster. And a lot of people are very quick to say, this is why it happened. I've reasoned it out and figured it out. But again, there's just so much that we don't know. Obviously, God is working in the world. Satan has an impact on the world. There could be imperceptible forces behind some of these things that we can't reason out through our natural observations. I think that's been probably one of my key takeaways from the book of Job is to speak humbly about what you think you know because you probably don't know as much about it as you think you do. Job's friends definitely teach us that. And even Job himself kind of says, you know, these things are happening. I can state that I haven't done anything wrong, but beyond that, how God is working, what he's up to, like I can't say. You know, I suspect that many of us, if we hadn't been pre-informed about the spiritual goings on behind the book of Job in Job 1 and 2, we probably also would have drawn wrong conclusions about Job, about his situation, and about his character, which should show us how easy it is to be led astray when we aren't guided by divine revelation. So what God reveals to us, we can know for sure. Everything else that we have to reason out on our own, we should at least remain humble about. So that's our study in Job 24, and Lord willing, we'll be back to hear from Bildad one last time in chapter 25 tomorrow.